They told him the 7-year-old orphan wasn't his. So he sent her away believing he'd been scammed, but a secret message from his dead lover reveals a lie. A lie so deep, it will make him burn her entire world to the ground. Welcome to Blissful Whispers. We have an incredible community watching from every corner of the globe. Let us know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now down in the comments. The clock on Sterling Reed's monitor was a tyrant. Each digital flip of a number was a silent, clean execution of another second of his life, perfectly allocated and accounted for. From his throne on the 50th floor of the Cygnus Dynamics Tower, he commanded a world of pristine data and predictable outcomes. The city of Denver sprawled below, a silent map of his success, the Rocky Mountains a jagged, distant line of irrelevant chaos. Here, in the heart of his empire, chaos was a foreign language. Every meeting was timed to the minute, every employee vetted for ruthless efficiency, every relationship managed like a portfolio. His life was a monument to control, built on two unshakable pillars: that his work was his only legacy, and that his past was a locked, soundproofed room. Today someone was picking the lock. It started with a crackle in his earpiece, an unscheduled breach. "Sir," came the hesitant voice of his head of security, a man named Dalton who was paid a fortune never to be hesitant. "We have a situation in the lobby." Sterling didn't look up from the quarterly projections. A situation. He hated the word. It was a lazy euphemism for a problem someone else had failed to contain. "Define situation, Dalton." "A protester? A reporter?" Pause. "A child, sir. A little girl. She's asking for you by name." The sheer absurdity of it made Sterling's fingers still on the keyboard. A child. In his lobby. It was like finding a wildflower sprouting through the marble floor. "Is she lost?" "She says she's not. She has something for you. An envelope. She's very insistent." Insistent. Another word Sterling despised when it wasn't his own. He pictured the lobby, a vast, echoing cathedral of gray stone and brushed steel, designed to intimidate foreign dignitaries and corporate rivals. What was a child doing there? He glanced at his schedule. He had a call with the Tokyo board in 7 minutes. This required surgical precision. 60 seconds, Sterling said, his voice clipped and final. "Send her up. You have 1 minute to get her in and out of my office." The elevator doors opened with a soft, expensive sigh, revealing Dalton escorting the smallest human Sterling had ever seen in his building. She had a shock of wild auburn hair, the color of a dying autumn leaf, and wore a simple blue dress that looked handmade. Her face was smudged with dirt, but her gaze was laser-focused, locked on him as she walked across the cavernous office. In her small hands she clutched a wrinkled, cream-colored envelope like a holy relic. She stopped 5 feet from his desk, a tiny, defiant island in an ocean of polished mahogany. "Are you Sterling Reed?" she asked, her voice clear and unnervingly steady. He leaned back, a flicker of irritation crossing his features. "I am. And you have 50 seconds left." She didn't flinch. She simply walked forward and placed the envelope on the edge of his desk. "My grandma Helene said you had to read this. She said it was the most important thing she'd ever written." Helene. The name was a ghost, a whisper from the locked room of his past. Clara's mother. He hadn't thought of her in years. His irritation evaporated, replaced by a cold, prickling curiosity. He picked up the envelope. The paper was soft, worn from being held for so long. The handwriting was elegant but shaky, the familiar cursive of a woman he remembered serving him lemonade on a porch swing a lifetime ago. He broke the seal, his movements suddenly feeling clumsy. The words inside were not a greeting. They were shrapnel. "Sterling, if you are reading this, then my time has run out and I have left my little bird all alone. I pray you have a heart left in that chest of yours to do what's right." His breath caught. He scanned the lines, his mind struggling to process the information. "It's about Clara. My sweet girl is gone, Sterling. She has been for 7 years. There were complications after the birth. She never got to hold her baby." The world tilted. Gone? Clara? The vibrant, laughing woman who had torn his world apart 8 years ago wasn't in another city, living another life. She was gone. The silent, sterile air in his office suddenly felt thick, unbreathable. He could hear the blood pounding in his ears. The words on the page blurred, then sharpened with brutal clarity. The baby survived. A little girl. Clara named her before she passed. She called her Piper. My Piper. He felt his stomach plummet, a sensation of falling from a great height. He dared to read the final world-ending sentence. I have loved her and raised her as my own, but my own body has failed me. The cancer is taking me home. Now she has no one. No one but you, Sterling. Piper is your daughter. The letter slipped from his numb fingers, fluttering to the floor. Impossible. A lie. A cruel, desperate fantasy from a dying old woman. The doctors had been clear. A series of tests after a sports injury in college had rendered a verdict as absolute as death. Sterile. Zero chance. It was one of the pillars of his life, a hard, cold fact that had shaped his relationships, his ambitions, his very identity. His gaze lifted from the fallen letter and landed on the child. Piper. She hadn't moved, her small hands clasped behind her back, watching him with an unnerving patience. And for the first time he truly saw her. It wasn't just the auburn hair, so much like Clara's. It was the stubborn set of her small jaw, the exact way he set his own when facing down a hostile board. It was the slight, inquisitive tilt of her head. And then her eyes. They weren't Clara's warm hazel eyes. They were his. A perfect, startling mirror of his own cool, steel-gray eyes, holding a depth of soul that had no place on the face of a 7-year-old. The two pillars of his life, his past locked away, his future without children, crumbled into dust. The clock on his monitor flipped to the next minute, unheard and irrelevant. His 60 seconds were up and the rest of his life had just begun. He was Sterling Reed, a man of empirical data and predictable outcomes, and he was staring at an impossible truth wearing a simple blue dress. The penthouse was less a home and more a statement. Spanning the entire top floor of Denver's most exclusive residential tower, it was a vast expanse of white marble, chrome, and glass. A void of color and warmth, suspended in the night sky. For Piper, who had only known the cramped, cluttered coziness of her grandmother's bungalow, it was like being swallowed by a cloud. She stood silently in the center of the living area, a tiny figure dwarfed by a cavernous ceiling and furniture that looked more like sculpture than anything meant for comfort. The glittering city lights outside the floor-to-ceiling windows were a cold, indifferent audience to her quiet devastation. Sterling didn't know what to do with her. He had brought her here because it was the only place he could bring her, but the child's presence in his pristine, ordered space felt like a glitch in reality. He did what he always did when faced with an unquantifiable problem. He weaponized his resources. While Piper stood motionless, he strode across the marble floor, his phone already pressed to his ear, his voice a low, urgent command. Julian, it's Sterling. I need you. Hypothetical scenario. An undocumented minor, potential guardianship claim, contested paternity. I need a preliminary brief on Colorado statute and a list of the top 3 family law specialists. Discretion is absolute. I want it in my inbox in 1 hour. He hung up before a reply could be offered. The next call was to a private number. Dr. Albright. Reed. I need a favor. I require an expedited, confidential paternity test. I need a sample collection kit couriered to my residence within the hour and a guarantee of absolute chain of custody security. The results need to be fast-tracked. He listened for a moment. I'll pay whatever it takes. His final call was the most difficult. He scrolled through his contacts to a name he hadn't used in years, a discreet liaison at the Department of Human Services. Robert Sterling Reed. I have a situation here involving a minor. She's an orphan. I need temporary high-quality care arranged. No, not a shelter. A private foster placement. Someone vetted. I'm handling the finances. 3 calls. 3 precise, logical steps to firewall an emotional cataclysm. He was building a wall of protocol around the gaping hole that had been blown through his life, processing grief and potential fatherhood as if they were a hostile merger. He finally turned to Piper, the strange, silent child who was the source of it all. He cleared his throat, about to say something sterile and procedural, when the private elevator chimed, announcing an arrival. Blair Covington swept into the room, a vision in a tailored black dress and a perfectly composed expression of concern. She was beautiful, sharp, and ambitious, all qualities Sterling had once found efficient and attractive. She took in the scene in a single sweeping glance. Sterling, disheveled and tense. The small, auburn-haired girl standing lost in the middle of the room. Sterling, darling, she murmured, gliding to his side and placing a perfectly manicured hand on his arm. Her touch was cool. Dalton called me. I came as soon as I heard. My God, you must be in shock. Her eyes flickered towards Piper, a flicker of something hard and analytical before the mask of sympathy slid back into place. And this must be the little girl. Sterling ran a hand through his hair, the gesture a rare crack in his iron composure. Her name is Piper. Blair, her mother. Clara, she's gone. She died 7 years ago. Oh, Sterling. Blair's voice was a masterclass in performative empathy. She pulled him into a brief, stiff embrace. That's just devastating. To lose her all over again like this. She pulled back, her gaze serious. Of course you're doing the right thing. The DNA test is essential. You're a brilliant man. You always protect yourself. She had aligned herself with him, with his logic. Now she began to gently, expertly poison the well. She walked slowly towards Piper, but her words were for Sterling. It's a heartbreaking story. Truly. A dying grandmother's last wish? She sighed, a delicate, thoughtful sound. But grief makes people do such desperate things, darling. People convince themselves of all sorts of fantasies when they're facing the end. She paused, letting the insinuation hang in the air. A child, a deathbed letter full of sentiment. It's a narrative, Sterling. A perfect story crafted to bypass a man's logic and go straight for his heart. She lowered her voice, making it an intimate conspiracy between the two of them. And, inevitably, his fortune. It's the oldest, cruelest trick in the book. Sterling felt a familiar coil of cynicism tighten in his gut. It was the same cold skepticism that had served him so well in the boardroom. Blair was speaking his native language. You said it yourself, she continued, her voice soft as silk. You never really knew what happened 8 years ago when she left. People can change, Sterling. Or worse, maybe they were never the person we built them up to be in our memories. She was no longer talking about the grandmother. She was talking about Clara. She was taking his grief, his shock, his oldest unhealed wound, and twisting it into suspicion. She was framing this tragedy not as a discovery but as an attack. He looked over at Piper, who had finally moved, curling up on the edge of the enormous white leather sofa. She looked impossibly small and fragile, already asleep from pure emotional exhaustion. A part of him, a strange, primal instinct he didn't recognize, wanted to walk over, cover her with a blanket, and shield her from the world. But Blair's poisonous words were already seeping into the cracks of his broken reality, turning his shock into doubt, his grief into a potential liability. He was a man who trusted data above all else, and Blair had just reminded him that, for now, the only data he had was a story. And stories, as he knew better than anyone, could be manipulated. The days that followed were a strange, uncomfortable truce, governed by the ticking clock of a laboratory. The DNA results were a pending verdict, and until they arrived, Sterling and Piper were suspended in a shared, silent limbo. The Child Services liaison, a pragmatic woman who recognized the unique volatility of the situation, had designated Sterling as Piper's temporary guardian. His penthouse, a minimalist fortress of solitude, had become an unwilling daycare. The space was actively hostile to a child's existence. Sharp-cornered glass tables posed a constant threat, priceless sculptures stood like fragile sentinels, and the silence was so profound that Piper's soft footsteps on the marble echoed like accusations. Sterling's initial strategy was avoidance. He confined himself to his home office, a sanctuary of data and control, attempting to run his global empire while a small, auburn-haired anomaly roamed his living space. But her presence was an undeniable force. It was in the scent of the peanut butter sandwich his private chef had begrudgingly made. It was in the faint sound of a cartoon humming from a tablet he had provided. It was in the unnerving quiet that fell whenever she wasn't making any noise at all. By the second day, he knew the situation was unsustainable. Piper had arrived with nothing but the clothes on her back and the worn bear clutched in her arms. She needed things. It was a quantifiable problem, and Sterling knew how to solve those. He approached the outing like a tactical mission. A chauffeured car took them to Cherry Creek, Denver's hub of luxury retail. He planned to delegate the task to a personal shopper, to simply acquire the necessary assets with maximum efficiency. But Piper disrupted the plan. She wasn't dazzled by the glittering showrooms or the racks of expensive children's couture. She ignored the silk dresses and cashmere sweaters, her attention captured by a simple pair of sneakers in a store window, their laces a brilliant, rebellious shade of neon green. "Those look like they can run fast," she said, her first unsolicited sentence to him. He bought them, along with a week's worth of practical, simple clothes she picked herself. For a man who dealt in billions, the small transaction felt strangely significant, a concession to a will that was not his own. On the way back, on a sudden, inexplicable impulse, he told the driver to stop at Washington Park. He didn't know why. Perhaps it was the suffocating silence in the car, or the way Piper was staring out the window at the families on the grass. He found a bench, a safe distance from the playground's joyful chaos, and immediately took out his phone. He was Sterling Reed. He didn't do parks. He did productivity. As he scrolled through market analyses, Piper, wearing her new sneakers, explored her small perimeter. She didn't run or shout. She watched a line of ants march across the pavement. She collected a handful of perfectly shaped pebbles. After a long silence, she came and sat at the other end of the bench. He could feel her watching him. "My mama was afraid of ladybugs," she said softly. Sterling didn't look up from his phone, though his thumb froze over the screen. "Grandma Helene told me," Piper continued, her voice thoughtful. "She said they tickled her and she'd squeak. And she said you used to pretend to catch them and eat them just to hear her laugh." The phone slipped from Sterling's hand, clattering onto the pavement. The world around him, the shouting children, the distant traffic, the crisp October air, vanished. He was 25 again, standing with Clara under a sprawling oak tree. A ladybug had landed on her nose, and she had let out an adorable, theatrical shriek. And he, in a moment of pure, uncalculated joy, had scooped it up and pretended to pop it in his mouth, earning him a scandalized laugh that he could, with terrifying clarity, suddenly hear again across the chasm of 8 silent years. He had forgotten that moment. Completely. It was a piece of his own life, a tiny, insignificant, and intensely private memory that had been erased by the bitterness that followed. There was no way Helene could have known that detail unless Clara had told her. And a grifter could never invent something so specific, so true. He looked at Piper, truly looked at her, and the carefully constructed walls of his doubt began to buckle. This wasn't a stranger. This was a living, breathing piece of his past. A piece of her. The connection he felt was no longer a hypothetical risk. It was a terrifying, undeniable pull, a current dragging him out into an ocean of feeling he had spent years convincing himself was a desert. That evening, the atmosphere in the penthouse had changed. Sterling found himself watching Piper as she drew at the massive dining table, her tongue poked out in concentration. For the first time, he saw not a problem to be managed but a child. A quiet, resilient little girl who was navigating an impossible world with a grace he couldn't comprehend. Later, she stood at the vast window overlooking the city, mesmerized by the sea of lights. She pressed her hands against the cool glass, her small fingers splayed out, leaving a constellation of perfect, tiny handprints against the skyline. Just then the elevator chimed. Blair entered, carrying a designer shopping bag and wearing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She assessed the scene, her gaze landing on the window. The smile tightened. "Darling, you look exhausted," she purred, walking towards Sterling. Her eyes flickered to the handprints on the glass, her lip curling in faint disgust. "Honestly, the mess. We'll need to have the cleaners do a full deep clean detail as soon as this whole ordeal is over." The word ordeal struck a dissonant chord. And mess? Sterling looked at the small handprints, at the way they caught the city lights. They weren't a mess. They were proof. Proof that a small, vibrant life was here in his sterile world. A hot, unfamiliar emotion surged through him. It was anger, but it was more than that. It was protective. "It's just a handprint, Blair," he said, his voice sharper than he intended. She stopped, turning to him in surprise. His tone was a challenge, a line drawn in the sand. He had never contradicted her on matters of taste or order. "It's life," he added, the words feeling foreign but right. "Things are supposed to get messy." Blair stared at him, her eyes narrowing. The mask of sympathy was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating assessment. She saw the crack in his armor, the first hint that her carefully administered poison might not be taking hold. She saw that the ghost of Clara Monroe and the tiny living echo of her were proving to be more powerful than she had anticipated. Blair sees a child's simple joy as nothing more than an inconvenience to be wiped away. If you believe every child deserves to be seen and cherished, not just tolerated, smash that like button. Only someone as cold and calculating as Blair would ignore it. The private elevator descended in absolute silence, but in Blair Covington's mind, a symphony of calculations was running at lightning speed. Sterling's defiance over a simple handprint was not an emotional outburst, it was a data point. A dangerous new variable had been introduced into an 8-year equation she had painstakingly balanced. The child, Piper, was not just a nuisance. She was a threat to a meticulously planned acquisition. The life she had built, the future she had secured as the inevitable Mrs. Sterling Reed, was under attack by the ghost of a dead woman and her inconvenient legacy. Blair had not come this far to be undone by sentiment. Her chauffeured car idled at the curb, a black phantom against the glittering backdrop of downtown Denver. She slid into the plush leather interior, her movements fluid and controlled. "Take the scenic route," she told the driver, a command for privacy. As the car pulled into the flow of traffic, she retrieved a secondary phone from a hidden compartment in her designer handbag. A sleek, anonymous device wiped clean after every use. There was only one number in the contacts, listed under the sterile moniker, Consultant. She pressed the call button, her expression hardening into one of absolute command. The voice on the other end was professional, devoid of warmth. "We're on schedule," it said. "There's been a complication," Blair stated, her voice a low, sharp whisper. "The asset is proving more persuasive than anticipated. The client is wavering. We can no longer rely on his skepticism alone. The quantitative results must be decisive." She stared out the window at the city lights blurring past, her reflection a cold, determined mask. "The samples from Reed's collection service will arrive at your lab within the hour. I am confirming the protocol now. The final report must show a 0% probability of a genetic match. Not low, not inconclusive. Categorical. Is that understood?" "The protocol is understood," the voice replied. "But a categorical falsification at this level requires overriding multiple security flags. It's a higher-risk procedure. The fee will need to be adjusted accordingly." Blair didn't hesitate. "Consider it adjusted." While the car wound its way through the darkened streets, she opened a laptop and, using a sophisticated VPN to reroute her signal through a half-dozen countries, accessed an encrypted cryptocurrency wallet. Her fingers moved with practiced speed across the keyboard. With a few clicks, she transferred a sum of untraceable Bitcoin equivalent to $250,000. The transaction was clean, clinical, and absolute, the cost of securing her future. This wasn't an act of jealous rage. It was a strategic execution as ruthless and impersonal as a corporate downsizing. She was eliminating a threat to her investment. Miles away in the silent penthouse, Sterling stood over the guest bed where Piper slept. The child's face was soft in the dim glow of the city lights, her auburn hair a splash of warmth against the cold, white sheets. The story about the ladybug echoed in his mind, a fragment of a life he had almost forgotten. For the first time in years, the hard knot of cynicism in his chest had loosened. What if it was true? The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. He felt a flicker of something he had long since buried, hope. He returned to his office, the quiet hum of his servers a familiar comfort. He sat in the dark, watching the city, waiting for the data that would either confirm this fragile new feeling or shatter it completely. An hour passed, then another. Just as the first hints of dawn began to soften the eastern sky, a notification chimed softly on his laptop. Subject: Confidential medical report Reed Sterling, Lab Ref, 88CX4. His heart hammered against his ribs. He clicked it open. The document was a wall of clinical text, scientific jargon, and legal disclaimers. He scrolled past it all, his eyes hunting for the one piece of information that mattered. He found it at the bottom of the second page, highlighted in a bold, sterile font. Analysis conclusion. Based on the genetic markers analyzed, the alleged father, Sterling Reed, is excluded as the biological father of the child, Piper Monroe. Probability of paternity, 0%. The numbers were a death sentence. Cold. Absolute. Empirical. The flicker of hope he'd felt was extinguished, snuffed out by the brutal certainty of data. Every doubt Blair had planted, every suspicion he harbored, came roaring back, now validated by science. He had been a fool. The story, the eyes, the ladybug, all of it was just part of an elaborate, cruel deception. The crack in his armor didn't just seal over, It was welded shut with a fresh layer of ice, colder and harder than before. He closed the laptop, the soft click echoing in the silent room like a cell door locking shut. The sun rose over the Rockies, spilling molten gold across the Denver skyline. But inside Sterling's penthouse, a glacial winter had set in. He sat in his office, the damning email still glowing on the screen, the numbers 0% burned into his vision. The fragile hope that had taken root in the park had been violently ripped out, leaving behind a raw, gaping wound. It wasn't just disappointment, it was a profound, soul-shaking humiliation. He had allowed himself to feel. He had allowed a silly story about a ladybug, a detail from a life he'd buried, to bypass his logic. He had almost fallen for it. The thought was nauseating. He felt the old, familiar bitterness rise in his throat, the same acrid taste of betrayal he remembered from 8 years ago. Clara, the radiant girl who had promised him forever, had left him with a single cryptic note. And now, her ghost had returned with an even more elaborate deception, using a child as the delivery mechanism for the lie. He wasn't heartbroken. He was furious. Furious at Helene for her manipulative, posthumous plea. Furious at Clara for the lingering power her memory held over him. But most of all, he was furious at himself for being so utterly, unforgivably weak. The private elevator chimed, and Blair entered, not with the triumphant energy of a victor, but with the solemn grace of a comforter. She moved with a preternatural awareness, sensing the shift in the atmosphere the moment she stepped into the room. She didn't need to ask. She saw the rigid set of his shoulders, the hard, empty look in his eyes, the dead screen of the laptop. "Oh, Sterling," she whispered, her voice a balm of perfect sympathy. She came to him, her hands gently rubbing his tense shoulders. "I'm so sorry, darling." He didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the cityscape outside. "I know you wanted to believe it," she continued, her words a soothing venom. "A part of you wanted that story to be true. But I knew you were being taken advantage of. I could see it from the beginning." She leaned down, her lips close to his ear. "You have a good, trusting heart. And they used it against you." Every word was a validation of his rage, a justification for the cold wall he was rapidly rebuilding around himself. She was right. He had been played. He was Sterling Reed, a man who could spot a flaw in a balance sheet from 1,000 yards, yet he had been blinded by a child with his supposed eyes. He stood up, his movements stiff and decisive. The period of emotional chaos was over. It was time to restore order. He picked up his phone, his thumb scrolling to the liaison's number. Blair watched, her expression a careful mask of sorrow, but a keen observer would have seen the glint of victory in her eyes. The call was brutally efficient. "Robert Sterling Reed. The results of the paternity test are conclusive. They're negative." He paused, letting the clinical finality of the statement land. "The temporary arrangement is terminated. I need you to come for the child immediately." He listened for a moment. "Yes, I'm sure." A flicker of something, guilt perhaps, made him add, "I'll set up an anonymous trust to cover her education and expenses until she's 18. My attorneys will handle it. Consider it a donation. Now please just handle it." An hour later, the liaison, a kind-faced man with weary eyes, arrived. Sterling retreated to his office, unable to watch, unable to face the human consequence of his data-driven decision. He closed the door, the soft click sealing him off from the quiet, heartbreaking scene unfolding in his living room. He could hear the low murmur of voices, the soft tread of footsteps, and then silence. He forced himself to walk to the window, his office a perch 50 stories above the street. He saw them exit the building, the liaison holding a small suitcase, and Piper, a tiny figure in her new neon green lace sneakers, clutching her worn teddy bear. She didn't look back. She just walked with a solemn, straight-backed resolve that broke something deep inside him. He watched the anonymous black sedan pull away from the curb, merging into the morning traffic, disappearing into the city. A problem removed. A threat neutralized. A devastating scam narrowly avoided. The silence in the penthouse was no longer just quiet. It was absolute, a crushing void where a small, humming presence had been. Blair came to his side, sliding her arm around his waist. "It's over now," she said softly. "You're safe. We can finally move on. I was thinking a trip? Monaco perhaps? To forget all this ugliness." He nodded, though he barely heard her. He felt nothing but a vast, cold emptiness. He had his control back. He had his orderly, predictable world. He had won. That afternoon he was a machine. He returned to his desk at Cygnus Dynamics, his focus a terrifying, laser-like intensity. He dismantled a rival's acquisition deal in a single conference call, his arguments merciless and brilliant. He restructured an entire department, his decisions swift and unsentimental. He worked late into the night, long after the rest of the tower had gone dark, throwing himself into the clean, unambiguous world of numbers and code, the only world that had never lied to him. He was colder, sharper, and more isolated than ever. He had successfully purged the emotional virus from his system. But as he stood alone in the dark, staring at his own reflection in the vast window, he saw not a victor, but a man in a cage of his own making, haunted by the ghost of a child who might have been his. A week passed. A sterile, ruthlessly efficient week. Sterling Reed had successfully cauterized the wound. He moved through his life with the precision of a surgeon, excising any trace of the emotional chaos that had threatened to infect him. He chaired a hostile board meeting, orchestrating a corporate coup with a chilling lack of sentiment. He escorted Blair to the Denver Art Museum's annual gala, a perfect portrait of a power couple, his smile as polished and empty as the marble floors. He had restored his world to its factory settings, controlled, predictable, and silent. But the silence was different now. It was a weighted, conscious thing. The penthouse, once his sanctuary of order, now felt like a pristine tomb. He found himself avoiding the vast living room window, a space now so clinically clean it seemed to vibrate with absence. Blair, ever the astute strategist, noticed his lingering melancholy and attributed it to residual stress. "Darling, we need to finalize the plans for Monaco," she said one evening, her voice smooth as she scrolled through flight options on her tablet. "And we really must have the staff clear out that guest room. There's no sense in keeping a shrine to that unfortunate business. We need a clean slate." Her words were meant to be therapeutic, a final closing of a painful chapter. But they sparked something cold and defiant in Sterling's chest. A shrine. Unfortunate business. She spoke of Piper as if she were a bad investment to be written off. For reasons he couldn't articulate, the idea of strangers packing away the few traces of the child's existence felt like a violation. "I'll handle it," he said, his voice flat. Blair looked up, surprised. "You? Sterling, you don't have to." "I'll handle it," he repeated, cutting her off. He walked towards the guest room, leaving her in a state of carefully concealed irritation. The room was as he remembered it, impersonal and still. The bed was perfectly made, the surfaces wiped clean. It was as if she had never been there at all. He started with the closet, which was already empty. He checked the drawers. Nothing. He was about to leave to declare the room sanitized when he noticed it. Tucked down between the mattress and the headboard, almost completely hidden, was the small, worn teddy bear. A surge of annoyance went through him. A final, pathetic piece of the charade, left behind by design or by accident. It didn't matter. He picked it up, his intention to march it directly to the incinerator chute in the service hallway. It was a cheap, well-loved thing, its fur matted in places, one of its button eyes slightly loose. It was insignificant. Rubbish. As his fingers closed around its soft, worn body, he felt something stiff inside a tiny hidden pocket on the bear's faded overalls. He paused. With a sense of detached curiosity, he reached in and pulled out a small, neatly folded square of paper. It was a photograph, its edges softened with age. He unfolded it. The breath caught in his throat. It was Clara. Younger, maybe 24, her head thrown back in a fit of unrestrained laughter, her auburn hair a fiery halo in the summer sun. It wasn't a posed shot. It was a stolen moment of pure, unadulterated joy. It was the Clara he had locked away in the deepest vault of his memory, the one before the silence and the cryptic note and the 8 years of bitterness. Seeing her like this, so vibrantly alive, was like a punch to the gut. His hands were trembling as he turned the photo over. On the back, written in the same elegant, shaky cursive from the letter, was a message. "For my little Piper." The words were a loving whisper from the grave. "This was the day your father gave me this bear." Sterling's heart began to hammer against his ribs. The bear. It wasn't just a random toy. His mind flashed back, the deafening noise of a summer carnival, the scent of spun sugar, the frustration of a rigged ring toss game. He remembered Clara's laughter as he missed again and again, and the ridiculous surge of triumph when he finally won this exact, silly, cheap stuffed bear, presenting it to her with the flourish of a knight. Just before he was sent away by a lie. The sentence landed like a bomb, obliterating the narrative he had clung to for 8 years. A lie. What lie? He had left her. Or so he had thought. Never forget the love you came from. He sank onto the edge of the bed, the photo and the bear in his hands. The clinical certainty of the 0% DNA result, the pillar upon which he had rebuilt his fortress, began to fracture. That cold, hard number was data. But this was evidence. A cheap bear and a faded photograph, imbued with a memory so specific, so deeply personal, that its authenticity was undeniable. How could Helene have possibly known about that day, that bear? The only way was if Clara had told her. And Clara would have only told her if the memory and the bear had meant everything to her. Suddenly, Blair's words echoed in his mind, dripping with a new, sinister meaning. People were never the person we built them up to be. He had thought she was talking about Clara. What if she had been talking about herself? He stood alone in the silent, empty room, caught in the crossfire between two impossible truths. One was a scientific report that had validated his deepest fears. The other was a cheap carnival prize that screamed of a love and a history he had been convinced was a lie. He was holding proof that something was profoundly wrong, that he was standing in the center of a web of deceit far older and more complex than he had ever imagined. The foundation of his reality had cracked wide open. Sterling is holding proof that something is wrong, but Blair has his complete trust. Should he ignore it or risk everything to uncover the truth? Comment, expose the lie, if you believe he needs to fight for Piper. People who side with manipulators like Blair will tell him to just let it go. Sleep became an irrelevant luxury. For the first time in his professional life, Sterling Reed was consumed by a problem that had no place on a balance sheet. The guest room remained his secret sanctum, the door closed to the rest of the penthouse. Inside, the small, worn bear and the faded photograph sat on the nightstand under the glow of a single lamp. They were no longer sentimental objects. They were exhibits A and B in the most important investigation of his life. The word Helene had written, lie, was a splinter in his mind, and he knew he couldn't rest until he had dug it out. He began to move through his life like a double agent. To Blair, he was contrite, seemingly recovering from the unfortunate business, with a renewed focus on their future. He discussed the trip to Monaco, nodded along to her plans for a charity auction, and played the part of the man who had been saved from his own foolish sentimentality. But behind the mask of normalcy, a cold, analytical engine was firing up. Every placating smile she gave him, every casual touch, now felt like a calculated move in a game he was only just beginning to understand. His first move was to go outside his ecosystem. His usual corporate fixers were too embedded, their loyalty compromised by their proximity to Blair. He needed an outsider, a ghost. A series of discreet inquiries led him to Marcus Thorne, a name whispered in circles of high-stakes litigation. Thorne was a former FBI cyberforensics agent who had retired to the private sector, specializing in uncovering the digital skeletons of the rich and powerful. He was a man who trusted broken code more than human testimony. Sterling, it's perfect, she breathed, her fingers tracing the embossed logo on the cover. There's a final signatory meeting with the legal team this afternoon at 3, he continued, sipping his coffee. Just a formality, but as co-chair, your signature is non-negotiable. I'll meet you there. She walked into the downtown offices of Sterling's corporate law firm at 3 o'clock sharp, a conquering hero. She wore a crimson dress, a slash of color that announced her victory. The receptionist led her not to the familiar grand boardroom, but to a smaller, more private conference room on a sub-level. The air was cool and still. The room was not what she expected. There were no lawyers, no stacks of documents. There was only a long, polished obsidian table, an enormous high-definition screen dominating one wall and 2 figures. Marcus Thorne, the rumpled investigator whose name she didn't know but whose presence felt immediately hostile, sat silently in the corner. And Sterling, who stood facing the vast window looking out at the city, his back to the door. A cold prickle of unease traced its way down her spine. Sterling? What is this? Where's the legal team? He turned slowly. The man who faced her was not the man she'd had breakfast with. The mask of the efficient CEO was gone, replaced by something ancient and glacial. His eyes were like chips of stone, devoid of any warmth or emotion she recognized. "They won't be joining us," Sterling said, his voice unnervingly calm. "This isn't a signing, Blair. It's a debriefing." Before she could respond, he gestured to the screen. It flickered to life, displaying a series of bank statements from a shell corporation based in the Cayman Islands. A single transaction was highlighted, a transfer of $250,000 in cryptocurrency. "Do you recognize this account, Blair?" Sterling asked, his voice conversational. "Of course not," she scoffed, though her heart began to hammer against her ribs. "This is insane. What are you doing?" "Just following the data," he replied. The screen changed, showing a secure audio file. He pressed a button on the remote. A man's nervous, distorted voice filled the room. "The money was for a discrete service. I was told to guarantee a 0% probability on a specific paternity sample. The client was very insistent on the protocol." Blair's face paled. "That's not, you can't prove anything. Anyone could have." "You're right," Sterling interrupted, his voice cutting through her denial. "Anyone could have. But the shell corporation used to pay this lab tech was funded and registered with a digital key." The screen changed again, displaying a string of alphanumeric code, a digital signature. A key that Marcus was able to trace back to a single source device. An image of her executive-issue tablet appeared on the screen, its serial number clearly visible. "Your tablet, Blair. The one you're carrying in your bag right now." Her composure began to crack. "This is ridiculous. It's a fabrication. My devices could have been cloned, hacked." "You're an expert on fabrication, aren't you?" Sterling said, his voice dropping an octave. The screen went dark, then lit up again with a new image. It was the photo. A young, laughing Clara, her face full of a joy Blair had spent years trying to erase. "You remember this, I imagine." The photos that followed were the ones that had destroyed Sterling's world 8 years ago. Clara with another man looking happy and intimate. "These were your masterpiece," Sterling continued as Thorne, in a flat, clinical voice, began to narrate the forensic analysis. Pixel densities, light source mismatches, compression artifacts. Each technical term was a nail being hammered into her coffin. The final image on the screen showed the photos side by side with the original, undoctored images Thorne had found, showing Clara laughing alone. "Sophisticated work for the time," Sterling mused, circling the table like a predator. "But technology evolves. Lies have a shelf life." Blair was trembling now, a mixture of fury and panic warring in her eyes. "She would have ruined you. A small-town girl who would have tied you down, filled your life with mediocrity. She wasn't on your level." "And the final piece of the puzzle," Sterling said, ignoring her outburst. The screen displayed a network analysis report, a web of data that culminated in a single highlighted IP address. "The anonymous email account that sent these forgeries to me. It didn't come from a rival. It came from inside Cygnus Dynamics." He brought up an archival photo, a company-wide memo from 8 years ago, featuring a picture of the marketing department. He zoomed in on a young, ambitious executive smiling brightly from her cubicle on the 34th floor. It was Blair. "It came from your desk, Blair. A week before you were promoted to a new position. A position that Clara had been informally offered." The truth, stark and irrefutable, hung in the silent room. Every lie, every manipulation, every carefully constructed piece of her 8-year plan was laid bare. The woman who had built an empire on deception was left with nothing but the ugly, exposed foundation. Her carefully constructed facade finally shattered, and the raw, obsessive core was revealed. She lunged forward, her hands gripping the edge of the table, her face contorted in a mask of rage. "Yes," she screamed, the sound echoing in the soundproofed room. "I did it. I did it all. For you. For us. That girl was never good enough for you. She was a distraction, a weakness. I saw your potential, Sterling. I saw the empire you could build, and I cleared the path. I gave you the freedom to become what you are. I built this life for you. You owe me this." Sterling watched her, his expression unchanged. The storm of her confession broke against the wall of his icy calm. When she was finished, panting and trembling, he let the silence stretch for a long, punishing moment. "You're wrong," he said, his voice devoid of all emotion. He walked to the window and looked down at the city below. "You didn't build a life." He turned to face her, his eyes finally showing a flicker of something, a profound, bottomless contempt. You built a cage on top of a grave. He straightened his tie, the simple gesture of final, devastating dismissal. Your access to Cygnus Dynamics and to all my personal accounts has been revoked. Dalton is waiting outside to escort you from the building. Your belongings will be sent to you. A flicker of disbelief, then terror, crossed her face. You can't. Sterling, after everything, you can't just throw me away. Oh, this is more than that, Sterling said, his voice dropping to a whisper. Marcus Thorne isn't just a private investigator. He's a registered consultant for the district attorney's office. They have a particular interest in cases of wire fraud, conspiracy, and the falsification of medical records. He gestured to the file Thorne was holding. They have everything. Your 8-year plan is about to become the state's 10-year problem. The door opened and Dalton, his head of security, stepped inside. Blair's rage collapsed into a strangled sob of pure, unadulterated shock. The Queen had been checkmated. As Dalton gently but firmly took her arm, she looked at Sterling one last time, her eyes pleading. But the man she had spent 8 years molding and manipulating was gone, replaced by a stranger who looked right through her. He had become what she'd always wanted, ruthless, decisive, and utterly devoid of mercy. And he was about to use all of it to destroy her. His life had been cleansed, but Sterling felt no triumph. As he drove away from the law firm, leaving the smoking crater of Blair's treachery behind him, the glacial fury that had sustained him melted away, leaving a hollow, aching void. He was free from her lies, but the truth was a brutal indictment of his own failures. He hadn't just been deceived. He had been a willing participant in his own blindness. He had let his pride and his old wounds fester, allowing a predator to convince him to abandon his own child. His daughter. The words were still foreign, a fragile concept he was only just beginning to grasp. The sleek lines of his custom sports car felt alien as he navigated away from the polished steel and glass of downtown Denver. He drove towards the city's forgotten neighborhoods, where the buildings were lower, the streets were grittier, and the illusion of corporate perfection gave way to a starker reality. The journey mirrored his own descent from the cold, sterile heights of his lonely tower to the messy, complicated, and essential truth waiting for him on the ground. Every mile was an act of penance, every red light a moment to be tormented by the image of Piper's small, solemn face being led away. He pulled up to the address, a drab 2-story brick building with barred windows and a patch of dry, brown grass for a lawn. The sign out front read, Northwood Children's Transitional Home. It was a place of institutional order, clean and bleak, radiating a profound sense of joylessness. The air inside smelled of disinfectant and boiled vegetables. It was a place for children without a place, a human filing cabinet. The thought that Piper had spent a single night here, believing her own father had rejected her, was a physical pain, a twisting knife in his gut. A weary-looking administrator pointed him towards the back. She's in the play area. She doesn't say much. The play area was a patch of cracked asphalt enclosed by a chain-link fence. The equipment was sparse and faded, a single metal slide and a set of swings. Piper was on one of them, but she wasn't swinging. She was sitting perfectly still, her small hands gripping the chains, her gaze fixed on nothing. Her neon green lace sneakers were scuffed, and she seemed smaller than he remembered, as if the weight of her loneliness was physically compressing her. She was a tiny island of stillness in a world that had offered her nothing but turbulence. He walked towards her, his expensive leather shoes crunching softly on the loose gravel. The sound was unnaturally loud in the quiet yard. He stopped a few feet away, his usual arsenal of confident words and commanding presence utterly useless. He was stripped bare, armed with nothing but the devastating truth and a heart full of regret. She looked up as his shadow fell over her. There was no surprise in her eyes, no anger, just a deep, weary watchfulness. She was a child who had learned not to expect anything good. He slowly knelt down onto the gravel, the sharp stones digging into the knee of his $1,000 suit. He didn't care. He needed to be on her level. He needed to tear down the tower he had hidden in for so long. Piper, he began, and was shocked by the sound of his own voice. It was hoarse, fragile, an unfamiliar instrument. There was a test. A medical test. And the results were wrong. He took a shaky breath, meeting her steady, gray gaze. The test was a lie. But that's not an excuse. I was wrong. The confession was the hardest, most necessary thing he had ever said. I was wrong to believe it. I was wrong to let you go. I was wrong about everything. Tears he hadn't known were there began to well in his eyes. I'm your father, Piper. He said the words not as a claim but as a vow. I am your father. And I am so sorry I let someone convince me otherwise. I am so sorry I wasn't there to protect you. He saw a flicker of something in her eyes, the first crack in her solemn facade. I'm never leaving you again, he whispered, the words a sacred promise to her, to Clara's memory and to himself. I'm here now, and I will never ever let you go again. She just stared at him for a long silent moment. Her small face was a mask of unreadable emotions. He could see her processing his words, weighing them against the profound abandonment she must have felt. He braced himself for her rejection, for the anger she was so entitled to. And then she moved. It wasn't a tentative step. She launched herself off the swing, a blur of motion, and crashed into his arms. The impact was startling, the force of it filled with a week of terror and a lifetime of yearning. Her small arms wrapped around his neck, her face buried in his shoulder, and for the first time since he had met her, she cried. It wasn't a child's quiet whimper, it was a storm of heartbroken, gut-wrenching sobs, a tidal wave of grief and fear, and a tiny fragile seed of relief. Sterling wrapped his arms around her, pulling her tight against his chest, a fierce, primal wave of protectiveness surging through him. He held his daughter. He held his crying, heartbroken, beautiful daughter. And as he knelt there on the gravel of that bleak playground, holding the entire weight of his new world in his arms, he felt the profound, terrifying, and magnificent burden of fatherhood settle over him for good. The truth is out, and a family is finally being pieced back together. Blair's web of deceit and emotional abuse has been destroyed. If you stand against manipulators who gaslight and destroy lives for their own selfish gain, hit subscribe right now. Only people who think it's okay to play with others' lives won't join our community. 6 months later, the silence was gone, replaced by the sound of laughter. The stark, minimalist penthouse had been sold, its cold memory traded for a sun-drenched house in a quiet Denver neighborhood with a sprawling oak tree in the backyard. The home was filled with the vibrant, happy chaos of a child's life. A half-finished painting was taped to the refrigerator, a pair of neon green lace sneakers was kicked off by the door, and light streamed through windows that were no longer impeccably clean. Sterling was on the floor, his bespoke suit long since replaced by a soft, worn sweater. He was deep in concentration, helping Piper construct a ridiculously complex Lego castle, complete with a lopsided tower and a dragon guarding the gate. He was no longer the man who measured his life in 60-second increments. He was a man who could happily lose an entire Saturday afternoon to a fantasy world of plastic bricks. A genuine, easy smile lit up his face as Piper directed him to place another turret, a look of pure, unburdened contentment that was entirely new. On the warm wooden mantelpiece above a crackling fire sat 2 photographs. One was the faded, candid shot of Clara, her joyful laugh now a cherished and constant presence in their home. Next to it was a new picture taken just last week on a hike in the mountains. In it, Sterling had Piper perched on his shoulders, both of them beaming at the camera with the same steel-gray eyes, their faces lit with an identical, radiant happiness. His transformation was absolute. The cold precision of the CEO had given way to the patient warmth of a father. He had traded his empire of glass and steel for a kingdom of Lego and laughter. He was no longer a man haunted by the ghosts of his past, but a man building a new future, one joyful, deliberate brick at a time.